looks at the impact of technology on government and the dissemination of information in Blacked Out, Government Secrecy in the Information Age, on Book TV, today at 10 a.m. Eastern. Harvard professor Michael Sandel writes about morality and politics in his new book, Public Philosophy. He spoke about it recently at the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service with the school's founding dean, former Senator David Pryor. This is an hour, 10 minutes.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out this evening, and we welcome you to the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service here in the old Choctaw Railroad Station in Little Rock, Arkansas. This building was built in 1899. It was used as a train station for the Rock Island route up until 1967. Then it became a restaurant, then a nightclub, and even a short time it was used as a church. But today it is occupying a new function, and a very exciting function, and that is it has become a school of public service, where young men and women from all over the world are going to be coming to this school and right next to the Clinton Library to learn the art and basically to hone their skills, young men and women from all over this country and hopefully from all over the world, in dealing and better functioning, let's say, as public servants in all walks of life throughout our respective communities throughout this world. So it's an exciting place, and tonight we have a very, very fascinating and well-known speaker. We welcome tonight Dr. Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel is the Ann and Robert Bass Professor of Government, Harvard University. He's asked me tonight to call him Michael, and he's to call me David. And tonight we're going to be talking about a recent book that he has just published. And that book is Public Philosophy, right here, Essays on Morality and Politics. Now, morality and politics could be to some an oxymoron. I'm not sure, but we'll talk about that just a little bit and talk about some of the things that evolved from another book that he has written and might carry some of the same themes and threads through this present book, and that book was Democracy's Discontent. And also a third book of Dr. Sandel's, of Michael's, was Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. And speaking of justice, Michael Sandel teaches a class. It is probably the most important course in political science at Harvard University. It is certainly the most popular. 900 students in Professor Sandel's class on justice. And tonight we're going to talk about justice. We're going to talk about political parties. We're going to talk about moral values. We're going to talk about political discourse. We're going to talk about community. We're going to talk about some of the hot issues that Michael is not afraid to talk about. And some of those are abortion, assisted suicide, the gap between the rich and poor, religion in public life, gay rights, Republicans versus Democrats, a series of essays that Michael Sandel has written over the course of years that brings to bear and puts into the public arena this great discourse on American politics that he knows so well and teaches so well. He constantly calls out, I think, in this book tonight that we're going to talk about, he's constantly making a plea, I guess you would say. He might not admit that. He might say that's not a proper interpretation. But I read it as a plea from Professor Sandel to let's all get together. Let's have a greater emphasis on citizenship. Let's see if we cannot return to some sort of civic virtue. And I think that this is his cry, this is his mantra, maybe even a theme for this book on essays on Morality in Politics, Public Philosophy by Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He has been a political journalist. He thought when he was 21 that's what he was going to do. He covered some of the Watergate hearings. He became a graduate of Brandeis University, magna cum laude, a Rhodes Scholar. This is why I have a hard time calling you Michael with all these great degrees and academic achievements. He lives in Brookline, Massachusetts with his wonderful wife and 2 sons, and he has been described, and I think this is a proper description, as one of the world's best known and most influential political theorists. Michael Sandel, how glad we are that you are here in Little Rock, Arkansas with us tonight at the Clinton School of Public Service, and you are our honored guest. And maybe you'd like to make an opening comment, and then we'll talk about your book.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thanks to all of you. It's a privilege to be here, and I came to Little Rock for one overriding reason, and that was because my friend David Pryor, who was the first dean of the Clinton School of Public Service, asked me to come, and for me that's reason enough, because I'm a great fan of David Pryor's, and I know that here he's considered he's as beloved a figure in this community as I've ever seen anywhere in the world, and that's because he's one of the finest people ever to have been involved in politics, at least as far as I know. So it's a privilege to be here.
Thank you, Michael.
As far as the themes that run through the essays in this book, David, that you mentioned, I think you did sum it up very well. It's, I suppose you could call it a plea and a set of arguments for a greater emphasis in our public discourse, in our political arguments, on community and the common good, citizenship and civic virtue. And it's also a series of arguments that we shouldn't hesitate to engage vigorously and directly. Moral questions in politics, questions about values, even though we disagree, and inevitably in a pluralist society we do disagree about morality, about religion, about values. But I think it's a mistake to try to, because of that disagreement, to try to empty political argument and political discourse of substantive debate about the good life, about morality, about values, and about the meaning of citizenship. So although the essays are on various topics, I would say, and I think you've identified very well, that is the central theme.
Why did you write this book, or why did you really write these essays over a period of time, I guess beginning back in the 1980s, this series of essays? Why did you? What motivated you, Michael?
Well, by profession, my day job, I'm a political philosopher. And so some of what I've written is written for other political philosophers, academics, but I think that political philosophy, of all academic subjects, has to have, as part of its subject matter, an engagement with the actual political questions, the concrete political issues of the day, not just as a way of trying to show that philosophy matters, though I think it does, and I think it's important to show that abstract ideas about justice and rights and community and the common good, they matter in everyday politics and everyday life. But I also think that at least some of us who work in the field of political philosophy should do what we can to contribute to, to bring some of these big questions to bear on contemporary political arguments, whether it's the debates between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, whether it's particular issues from health care to distributive justice to taxation to stem cell research to abortion. Almost everything we argue about in politics rests on some values, some particular idea of the good life, some notion of what the common good consists in. And very often the only way we can make progress in political argument is to try to identify the larger goods that are at stake. And I think that makes for a richer politics, a healthier politics.
And does this come to the definition of what moral values are all about in this discourse in our society, in our country especially? And aren't we framing the issue of moral discourse very differently today than, say, we did 50 years ago?
Yes.
How are we discussing these issues in a different way than we were 50 years ago?
Well, I think one difference is when we talk today about morality in politics, the first thing that comes to mind often are one or two or three fairly narrow questions, important questions, but we often think and act and argue as if they represent the whole of morality in politics. And those issues, unsurprisingly, are abortion, the debate about abortion and whether there's a right to abortion or should be. Increasingly, gay rights, same-sex marriage, and to a lesser extent in the last campaign, stem cell research, and the debate about that. These were the three questions that people thought of when the question of moral values in politics came up. I think all three of those are very important questions, but I think it's a mistake to assume that everything else we argue about has only to do with economics or only to do with policies and programs and technocratic questions. I think we need to broaden our understanding of what counts as discussing moral values in politics. And there's a political dimension to this. In recent years, Republicans have been much more effective than Democrats at bringing moral and even religious sensibilities to bear in political discourse. And when you talk about over a period of time, 40, 50 years ago, a generation ago, it was those, let me put it another way, there's nothing intrinsically conservative about bringing moral values into politics. A generation ago, it was those on the left or on the progressive side of the political spectrum who spoke most explicitly in a language of moral and sometimes religious concerns. Think back to Martin Luther King, who brought moral and religious arguments to bear in the civil rights debate, or Robert Kennedy. What's interesting is that since Ronald Reagan has shifted, and moral values in politics, the ability to address the moral and spiritual yearnings of the American public, has been by and large monopolized by conservatives. And I think that goes back to Reagan.
Now, in 2004, this would be George W. Bush and John Kerry race.
Right.
You cite some remarkable exit polling results.
Right.
That relate to the moral value issue. Would you please share those with our audience?
Right.
I was just stupefied when I saw these enormous numbers, the 80-18%, if you would.
Well, the exit polls in the last election showed that when people were asked what issue mattered most to their vote, more people said, more than said the war in Iraq or terrorism or the economy, more people said moral values, the moral values issue. And of the people who cited moral values as the reason for their vote, among that group, 80% voted for George W. Bush, only 18% for John Kerry. Now, there was a lot of discussion after that polling result became known about how the question had been framed, whether the issues that people were asked to choose among were well defined. But something was going on. Something was going on if there was that big a difference between the Bush and the Kerry voters in terms of citing moral values. And I think Democrats have actually done a poor job. And though I sympathize with liberal and progressive politics in the book, I'm critical of the way in which liberals and progressives and Democrats have allowed the moral and spiritual dimensions of politics to slip away from their political discourse and be and really become the monopoly of conservatives.
When you mention the fact that the moral issues sort of got away, let's say, from the Democrats, I think there was a quote in your book, and I can almost quote it here. I had written it down. Somehow, quote, somehow all of us missed this moral values thing.
Right. That was a CNN reporter responding to this poll.
Right. That they were just
the moral values thing.
Dumbfounded about this
Right.
18%.
Right.
Now, the moral discourse and the ability to frame these issues is so critical. When you had first written, as I understand it, one of your earlier essays, 1988,
Yeah.
that would have been Dukakis and Bush won, I guess.
Yes.
And Ronald Reagan was leaving office at that time.
Right.
You received a letter. I believe you had written in the New Republic, but you'd received a letter from a young man. I wonder if you might tell us about that letter you received.
Right.
I thought that was kind of intriguing.
Right. This was one of the essays in the book, appeared as a cover story in the New Republic, as you say, David, in 1988. And it was trying to say, look, the Democrats have something to learn from Ronald Reagan. And the Democrats have to find a way to recapture the language of community and family and of moral values, and to find a way of telling stories and articulating their positions in a way that makes the moral dimension of those positions more immediate, more compelling. And Ronald Reagan did that for conservatism. And so I got a letter after that article appeared, a letter from a reader in Little Rock, Arkansas, the then governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. And he wrote me. We hadn't.
Did you solicit this letter?
No. We hadn't hadn't met before, and it was a very generous and long and thoughtful letter, saying that he agreed with this diagnosis. He agreed that the Democrats had failed to speak the language of community and the language of moral values, that they needed to find a way, and he enclosed a few speeches that he said he was giving around the country to try to develop this. And I was struck by the letter, though I confess I didn't pursue it. I tucked it away. I still have the letter, by the way. I dug it out.
You could probably sell that letter right now.
I could. I suppose I could sell it, but as you know, I've got some essays here where I'm against auctioning, using markets to auction.
I think that you have. I think one of your chapters relates to that.
Right. Against celebrity auctions, the tackiness of it, and the limits. I'm all for the limits of markets. But in any case, so that was the striking letter, especially in retrospect.
Was that your first opportunity, let's say, to correspond or to have any relationship with then Governor Bill Clinton? That was sort of your personal introduction to him. I believe that he stated here on page 38, I believe this is correct, that, or maybe perhaps you stated this, his genius, Reagan, was to bring people together in a single voice. And all of a sudden this voice became a sort of a voice for morality. I think that's
Reagan.
The implication.
Right.
Ronald Reagan, yes.
Right. I think that what Reagan succeeded in doing was bringing together the two strands within conservatism, conservative public philosophy. Because there are actually two. Conservative public philosophy has always, in America, had a tension between two impulses. One is, we think of conservatives as being pro-market, individualistic, laissez-faire, keep the government out of our affairs, let individuals choose for themselves, the individualist strand. And that's the kind of Milton Friedman, free market libertarian strand of conservatism.
Well,
Barry Goldwater.
Yeah, Barry Goldwater.
So going all the way back
good
there.
example.
But that by itself was not enough to win for Republicans or for conservatives major public support. And what Reagan did was to connect that strand of conservatism, the individualist, laissez-faire, pro-market strand, with another strand, which is a communal, traditionalist, the social and cultural conservatives. We speak of them. And these are not people who want to keep government out. in the name of individualism. These are people we think of when we think of the of Christian fundamentalists, the Christian right, Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority up through Pat Roberts and the Christian Coalition. This is another strand of conservatism. And it's concerned with trying to shape character, bring morality and religion into politics. So it's in tension with this libertarian strand of conservatism. And Reagan managed, this is what I think was his political genius, to bring these two strange ideological bedfellows together in a conservative movement that won him the presidency and actually made the Republican Party ascendant for a generation.
And you try to, and you do, draw the distinction, it appears to me very well, of between the Democrats and Republicans in how to espouse these issues. You state here on page 39, quote, "To their political misfortune, Democrats
Right.
in recent years have not spoken convincingly about self-government and community."
Right.
And President Reagan talked about community, and he
did.
talked about self-government. He talked what a shining
City on the hill.
And things like that. He, made people feel good. I don't know if that translated in anything that we think of today as good, but it sounded awful good at the time, and maybe some good came out of it. He used to make me feel good, And,
Did it really?
I was in another political party, and he made me feel good.
You were the loyal opposition, but
And here you said they believe, and speaking of Democrats, they believe government should protect people's rights, not promote civic virtue. And I think the promotion of civic virtue by a political party goes into another broad-scale vision, and that would be tolerance, which you always are calling for in your essays, tolerance. And the promotion of civic virtue, to say what is virtuous for Michael Sandel, what is virtuous for David Pryor, may not be virtuous for everyone else. Should we define what is virtuous for someone else? Should we censor what they see? And so these debates have been going on for a long time. I think they're going to go on a long time in the future.
Well,
tolerance.
I think you're right. And this question of civic virtue and its relation to tolerance is a big and a difficult question. I think one of the reasons that liberals and progressives were, for a generation, uneasy with the language of community and civic virtue and character formation was actually, it was a good reason. There was a good reason underlying the impulse to worry about forming virtue and promoting morality in politics. And you can see what lies behind this reluctance if you look at the way in which, very often, those who do bring morality and religion into politics have narrow, intolerant voices and do want to impose a particular moral or religious view.
I certainly
others.
learned one thing from your book, if I may interrupt, because it's right on this point. I had no idea that there was such thing in the last few elections as, quote, and this is what you call it, the God-o-meter, unquote.
Oh, this is on
and
a
the
website.
God-o-meter is that makes reference to how many times a candidate uses God in his speeches, and you said how many are in the State of the Union messages of George W. Bush versus other presidents. Is George W. ahead of the rest of them in mentioning God?
He is ahead.
Okay.
He is ahead.
So he comes up well on the God-o-meter, is that right?
This was something, this was not my invention, David.
Okay.
But it was.
Yeah, it has its...
no, I noticed it on a website.
Okay.
There was a website that was tracking...
BeliefNet.com is the God-o-meter.
Well, this was during the 2000 campaign, and then they continued it. What happened is Democrats learned this lesson about how important it is not to neglect the moral and spiritual dimensions of politics. And so beginning in 2000, there were attempts by politicians of all parties to salt their rhetoric with generous portions of references to God and to religion and to faith. In fact, it's a fascinating reversal. If you go back to 1960, remember the John F. Kennedy campaign, and he was trying to set to rest the Catholic issue,
Sure.
as it was called then.
He went to the ministers, yes.
He did, in Houston, Texas. And he made a statement saying, I am the Democratic Party candidate for president. I'm not the Catholic candidate for president. And the way he tried to set the issue to rest was to say that my religious convictions are matters of private conscience and will have no bearing on the conduct of my office. Now, it's understandable why he had to say that. But actually, that gave away too much if you think about it. Because if you really do have moral convictions that may be rooted for many people in religious convictions, it's not clear that those convictions should have no bearing on the conduct of public responsibilities or on the policies or positions one takes. That was a more secular time in American politics. Now, fast forward to the 80s, the 90s, and
even fast
the
forward
2000s.
to Jimmy Carter in '76.
Well, there you go.
He
In fact, it's interesting. Since LBJ won in 1964, the Democrats have only elected two presidents in that 40-year period. One was Jimmy Carter, a born-again Christian. The other was Bill Clinton, who, whatever his personal foibles was, he had a keen ear and an instinct for the moral and spiritual language and yearnings of the electorate. He could speak that language. He could hear it. He could speak it. He sensed it. But for the most part, putting aside Carter and Clinton, for the most part, the Democratic nominees over the last couple of decades, from Dukakis, Gore, Kerry, bright, capable, intelligent, good people, but their orientation to politics was more policy-oriented. It was programmatic, and their political language reflected that. It didn't have the sense of narrative or the moral and spiritual tone that in some ways Bill Clinton's political rhetoric had, and in other ways Ronald Reagan's did. And so what happened is, I think by 2000, going back to your Godometer anecdote, there was such a transparent attempt by politicians of both parties to introduce God and religion into political discourse that it became transparent, it became unconvincing, but it was obvious, and so people began to kind of keep track of the number of references. But I think what this reflects is a kind of groping, a struggle to find a language that does address moral and spiritual questions, but in a pluralist society where people do disagree about morality and religion.
Just play like you're in your class at Harvard. One of your students gets up, Professor Sandel, I'm going to go back home and I'm going to run for governor of Minnesota, Mississippi, Louisiana, wherever it might be. And I'm going to run as a Democrat. And I have a strong belief in a faith system. How should I involve myself or involve that issue in that campaign? What should I do? Should I say, well, I don't want to talk about my faith, I don't want to talk about my religion? Or should you just bring it out? How do I talk about it? How do I discuss it? How do I frame it? If one of your students might ask you that.
Right.
Would you have an answer?
Well, I would have a careful answer.
Yes.
And because it so much depends on the person, on his or her convictions, and on the political questions at stake. I think as a purely autobiographical matter, no, I don't think candidates have to bandy about their faith and their convictions just for the sake of proving that they have some. But I do think, and I would recommend to the student candidate to try to think through in a serious way the dimensions of one's faith, or the elements of one's moral convictions that bear on the policy positions and also the philosophical outlook that a candidate would bring to public life and to public service. So, for example, now this is obvious when we're debating about abortion or stem cell research. But what about when we're debating health care or questions of economic justice or the gap between the rich and the poor or the responsibilities that affluent countries have to poor countries? All of those questions, civil rights being another example, all of those questions are political questions and legal questions that are also moral questions and sometimes ones that draw on matters of faith. So I would tell that student not to hesitate to try to articulate the moral underpinnings of the positions that he or she takes on the full range of issues, not just on abortion and gay rights and stem cell research.
Switching gears just a little bit, Michael, you have a chapter about Robert Kennedy. And I really think this is a very, very interesting point. To recall his death, Robert Kennedy, is to wonder what might have been. And this is a message to the Democrats. In the decades since his death, the Democratic Party has failed to recover the moral energy and bold public purpose to which RFK gave voice, unquote. Your words.
Well, he's one of my heroes, Robert Kennedy. And he was a figure, in some ways, who was uneasy with the public philosophy of liberalism as it had developed by the late 1960s. By which I mean, I think he was uneasy about the fact that liberalism had come to neglect or downplay questions of community, the common good, civic virtue, the themes that we've been talking about. And I think he understood this by the time he ran in 1968. And we can look back at Martin Luther King as another exemplar of a progressive politics that drew on moral and religious themes. I think Robert Kennedy was beginning to articulate such a politics in 1968 before he was assassinated. And what happened to liberalism and to the Democratic Party, in large part after his death, was a kind of loss of moral energy and a tendency to talk in terms that were more technocratic, more programmatic, more policy-oriented, all of which is fine and important, but it was policies and programs to the neglect of moral and the spiritual dimensions of public life. I think that's what Robert Kennedy grasped and what we lost when he was assassinated.
Bill Bradley, former Senator Bradley, was here at our school yesterday and spoke with our students. And the students quizzed him very specifically about the Democratic Party and running for office. And Bill Bradley was very, very honest with our students in saying that he believes today that if you get up and speak from your heart on an issue, and you're really convincing that you speak from your heart with sincerity, that the voters today might be inclined to follow you and support you because they may not agree with you every time, but they see you're leading with your heart. Right. And that may have been some of that energy that you had talked about with Robert Kennedy.
Right, and a moral core, a sense, I think voters will sense that there is some moral core, rather than just trying to throw in references, gratuitous references to God or to faith.
Well, do we have those voices? Do we have those voices today that are clued into how to frame these issues, how to go out and talk to voters and people and citizens? Is John McCain speaking to these issues?
Well, I was going to say I find it difficult to find among the current on the current political scene compelling voices of this kind. I think part of John McCain's appeal is not just his authenticity, which is important, but I do think that people sense a moral seriousness in him, and here's an important concrete expression of it. The idea of sacrifice and the language of sacrifice in politics, in many ways, we're allergic to it. Because for politicians to ask the public for sacrifice is to run the risk of offending them, rather than to tell people what they can get from politics or the public arena. But I think there is a hunger for political figures, Democratic or Republican, who are able and willing to speak about sacrifice and civic sacrifice. And I think that was one of the missing themes in the last election. John Kerry tried very hard, and unsuccessfully in the end, to mount a persuasive critique of the Bush administration. But I think he missed the opportunity. Here was an administration that was mounting a war in Iraq. Put aside for the moment the question whether that was a good or bad idea, right thing or wrong thing to do. But mounting a war without asking the American public as a whole to sacrifice at all for that war. And some reporters asked Bush, why aren't you calling on the American people to sacrifice, apart from the soldiers, the men and women fighting and dying over there? And his answer was, well, they are sacrificing. They're having to wait longer in lines at the airport. Mm-hmm. Now, he missed it. George Bush did, President Bush did. But so did John Kerry miss it as a theme. It's a larger civic theme. What should we be asking of ourselves when we have men and women, young men and women, fighting in Iraq? Should the sacrifice take the form? And what about tax cuts at a time when the sacrifice? The tax cuts could have been attacked as a refusal to live up to the moral and civic responsibility of shared sacrifice, to say nothing of a gasoline tax, which I think could have been defended in similar terms, not just on policy grounds, though there are good policy reasons for energy independence, but also it's a call to shared civic sacrifice for the common good.
E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post, and I quote, "No matter what your politics are, you will find Michael Sandel's public philosophy exciting, invigorating, discerning, and encouraging. Conservatives will discover a liberalism they didn't know existed, profoundly concerned with responsibility, community, and the importance of individual virtue. Liberals and Democrats who know their side need to be engaged in public philosophy will find its bricks and mortar, its contours and basic principles right here in these pages. Public philosophy, essays on morality and politics." Why don't we open this up to the floor right now if we could?
Sure, by all
Michael
means.
Sandel, thank you. If we have a question from the audience, we'd be proud to have it. One of our fine students is coming in.
Professor Sandel, thank you for coming this evening.
Please, if you would, state your name.
Sure. My name is Malcolm Glover. I'm from Bowie, Maryland, and I'm a student here at the Clinton School. And I was just wondering if you could speak to, I guess, the time that we live in, when a certain person's morality is often seen as out of the mainstream. And I would ask you to think back to the funeral of Coretta Scott King and the comments by Reverend Joseph Lowry or by former President Jimmy Carter. And immediately journalists said, well, their comments were insensitive or their comments were uncalled for at that occasion, but their comments dealt with morality and the importance of taking care of the homeless and the poor. So how does one get out their message when they talk about the importance of morality and talk about the poor and talk about the homeless, and it's immediately labeled as out of the mainstream or unimportant? How do we get that message out?
Right. Well, thank you, Malcolm, for the question. I watched that funeral on TV, and I was struck by it. In fact, I watched it on C-SPAN as it was replayed. And what struck me Well, and I didn't think there was anything, I myself didn't find their comments out of line or inappropriate. This was a political funeral. And it was a political event. The current and these past presidents were there. They were all speaking. It was an American civic public, and therefore political occasion. And that some of the speakers talked about questions of poverty and tweaked the sitting president who was there. That's part of the vitality, the humor, the vigor, the pulling and tugging of politics. I think, and we often hear, we hear a lot about the loss of civility in politics these days, and I think that's a legitimate concern. But I don't think that civility in politics should suffocate or override vigorous disagreement about things that matter, poverty among them. I would also say, on the other side of the political spectrum, abortion and same-sex marriage and stem cell research and so on. I think all of that has an appropriate place in political discourse. Vigorous argument, moral and religious argument, if that's what the people on the various sides, if that reflects their convictions. And so I think in some ways the answer to what people see as the loss of civility is not to mute our voices and not to try only to say in public something that everybody can agree to, because that drains public life and civic life of all of its energy and all of its vitality and all of its meaning. So I'm for more engagement with moral and even religious controversy in politics, rather than trying to tamp it down.
Michael, you do discuss here in your book about our new public discourse and in the public arena, that it seems to be now, as you say, that political discourse becomes increasingly preoccupied with the scandalous, the sensational, and the confessional, as purveyed by tabloids, talk shows, and eventually the mainstream media as well. And so we've sort of morphed into a situation here that's pretty new for us in the last few years. I mean, this seems to be where our discussion of politics and government and the rules that concern our lives are discussed. And I'm afraid they're in 30-second sound bites. I'm not sure.
Right. Well, and I think sadly this has been unfolding really for the last 2-3 decades with the decline of the quality of news coverage on the network evening newscasts, the preoccupation with the entertainment values, and the ability to make a profit. A large part of this, it's not only a change in the culture. It's also that as the networks were bought up, the commercial networks, bought up by large corporations, they became profit centers and had to make, and were expected to make profits. And in the past, they were seen as instruments of public service and public prestige for the networks, for the parent networks. So, but I also think that the preoccupation with the sensational and with entertainment values and with scandal, narrowly conceived, reflects a kind of vacancy and emptiness in the substance of our political debate. So engaging more directly with questions that matter, I think, would be one way of trying to drive out the preoccupation with sensation and scandal and entertainment.
Does this lend itself to people finally saying, I have no control, I have no input into the system, I'm dropping out of the system, I'm not going to vote? I mean, is that happening to us, or has that made it happen, or
I think
part
it's
of the
contributed.
equation? Yes.
I think it has contributed to a frustration.
You call that a growing sense of disempowerment, and I can sense it on a daily basis.
Right, and another part of this is, which a lot of people have written about, is the role of money in politics, and people feeling that their voices matter less and less because of the the power of money, and we see now with the lobbying scandals and so on, perhaps there'll be some attempt to reform the lobbying
They may
practices.
straighten out the lobby issues,
You
I'm
think?
not sure, but until they straighten out the campaign contribution issues, the lobby issue is not going to go away. It's always going to be there. I think the root of the problem is how much it takes to run for office.
Yeah.
Here's a man who may be running for office.
Good evening. I appreciate your coming. My name is Dr. Emilio Tirado. I'm a surgeon here in Little Rock, and I have two questions, some of which you've already touched upon. One is the lack of civility. We're told that we've hit a new nadir in lack of civility, especially in politics. Considering our history in this country, and I'm thinking specifically of the Jefferson-Adams campaign, which was so vicious in many ways, has there truly been a difference? Are things really worse today than they were 200 years ago? And the other question is, you touched upon religion, and the talking heads on TV tell us frequently that the United States is the most religious and country, and we bring morals into our politics a lot, at least in the last generation. That being the case, how do we explain that the United States and I think it's South Africa are the only two industrialized countries that don't protect the members of their society by covering everybody with some kind of health plan, yet the Europeans, who are a lot less religious than we are, do that for their population?
Right. Two interesting, very interesting
Thank you,
questions. I don't think there is a simple or easy translation between religious values broadly conceived and any particular policy on health care. I myself am in favor of a system of universal coverage and single payer, simple, straightforward system. But the Democratic Party has been trying since Harry Truman to get some kind of universal health care and has failed. I think one of the reasons, putting aside the power of the health insurance industry, I think one of the reasons that they failed, including, if I may say so, you'll forgive me given our setting here in the attempt during the Clinton administration to do it, is that the proposal was not only too complicated, but the case for it has not been put in clear terms of the mutual responsibilities of citizens to one another, and also in moral terms, the responsibility that we have to care for our neighbors and our fellow citizens. So I think not only a simpler proposal, not only an attempt to face down the health insurance industry, but also an attempt to place the argument for health care in a framework, in a moral framework and in a civic communal framework. You mentioned the European countries that do have national health systems of various kinds, public provision. It's not because they're more religious, but there is an ethic of solidarity that is present in the public cultures of many European countries that we struggle with in this country, that we don't quite have to the same extent. And the European welfare states drew on a sense of social solidarity and mutual obligation of citizens that here we in the more market-oriented individualist society find difficult to project into politics. As far as civility today as compared to the way it was in the 18th and 19th century, there were some vicious things in the 19th century, including the caning, you remember, was it in the House or in the Senate floor, David?
It was in the Senate, I
In the
think.
Senate. And so I would not say that the incivility of today is the worst in American history. It's not. There is more partisanship today, especially, I think David would agree, in the Senate and Congress, in part because since the Civil Rights Act, the South has become Republican. Before it was Democratic. You remember there were Southern conservative Democrats 2 generations ago. There were liberal Republicans. A lot of that has sorted itself out for electoral and political reasons. So the parties are more ideologically homogenous than they once were. And I think that's contributed to, would you agree with that, David?
I think it has. I mean, how can I tell you this?
No,
but
no,
I think,
you've been there.
I just think that one thing that, I just don't think that congressmen and senators any longer have the luxury of knowing each other. When, in fact, Senator Bradley and I were talking about this last evening. When we used to have potluck suppers at our homes. We knew their children. Alan Simpson, Ann Simpson would come to our house. We would go to theirs. We all had these wonderful little Sunday night get-togethers, and Republicans and Democrats, and we knew the names of their dogs and everything. You know, but here and now, because of this vast need to go out and raise all the money it takes to run, you don't have time to do that. I mean, every minute is occupied, as they say, dialing for dollars. And man, is that unhealthy. I just think it's led us to a very, very bad state. And our people don't know each other any longer, and it's a sad, sad state. Some of the greatest people I ever knew were senators and members of the House, but up in the present environment, I would not get to know very many of them. David?
David Strickland in Little Rock. And the separation of church and state is something that isn't quite dead yet. It seems to be kind of quaint in some circles, but how can we in a pluralistic society inject moral and religious convictions into the public discourse without sacrificing the separation of church and state?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the worry about pluralism and toleration, which are terribly important to try to nurture and cultivate and promote, and a concern for the separation of church and state, underlie the reluctance of a great many people to mix moral and religious discourse with political discourse too readily. And here's what I would say to that worry. I think it's important to distinguish between the separation of church and state on the one hand and the separation of religion and politics on the other. In fact, separating church and state, having no established church, is the best way of permitting a healthy intermingling of politics and religion. And what I mean by that is not people using politics and law to impose their religious beliefs on other people. But what I do have in mind is welcoming in public discourse, in a pluralist society, the moral and sometimes the religious convictions that people may bring with them to politics. I don't think we can ask people to park their moral and religious convictions outside before they enter the public arena. Now, among my fellow political philosophers, this is a big argument, because a lot of political philosophers, whom I respect but disagree with, say, no, that's opening the way to trouble and intolerance and coercion. And so what we need to do is to try to ask people not to shed their moral and religious convictions, but to translate it when they enter the political arena, to translate those concerns into principles that everyone can agree to. And there is a raging debate among political philosophers about that. I think we should not require people to try to put aside the substantive conceptions of the good or of morality or even of religion that may bring them to public life. I would rather have that engagement in the open, because what happens if you try to keep it out, if you try to make politics neutral, with respect to questions of the good life, substantive morality, is that there will be a kind of void, a moral vacuum that will be filled with the narrow, intolerant voices. Fundamentalists will rush in where liberals fear to tread. And that's why I think that's why Martin Luther King had it right. The letter from a Birmingham jail, that famous document, was filled with religious references. It was addressed to fellow ministers, and yet it's a great document of American politics, a civic document and moment in American public life. And back when Martin Luther King was drawing on religious and moral themes for civic purposes and civil rights, there was a critic, a Southern minister, who said, Martin Luther King is making a mistake. Ministers should save souls, and they shouldn't try to enter politics. And you know who that was? Jerry Falwell.
Wow.
And
No kidding.
he changed his mind. He changed his mind by 1980. And it came around to this other view. I actually think when he did change his mind, he was right. Not in the politics that he promoted, but in the idea that it's a mistake to try to separate these two.
Wow.
Because I think that will open the way to more intolerance than it will prevent.
Very good. Dawn, another one of our students. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Dawn Zekas. I'm originally from South Dakota, and I'm one of the students here at the Clinton School. I think one of the most disheartening things in our society today is the lack of disengagement and involvement of the youth in civic and political society. As a political philosopher in the realm of education, I'm curious to get your thoughts on the obvious need for educating our young people about political philosophy, about civic virtues, etc. Yet, how is it that you do that in the face of what is being called today the liberalization of higher education?
And by the liberalization of higher education, tell me what you mean.
Well, I mean, for instance, there's been many recent attacks, in particular in my home state of South Dakota, that the Democrats, the liberals, are taking over higher education, and that if you're a conservative or a Republican, that you are discriminated against and don't have a voice in the classroom or in higher education today. And I know that's been a big issue, particularly in my home state, and one is starting to grow across the country.
Right.
This whole idea of not being able to teach politics or philosophy without being afraid that your job or your stature within the university is going to be on the line. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
And so this is, are you referring to what sometimes people call the complaint about political correctness in the academy? Mm-hmm. And are you suggesting that is the problem the complaint about political correctness, or is it what you take to be the fact of political correctness?
I'm curious to get your thoughts on the complaint of it, and as a person who teaches in that area, what your thoughts are concerning that.
Well, I've heard the complaint, and I think that there may be some validity. And it'll depend, different parts of the country, different colleges and universities, the situation is different. It may be that in some places, conservative students or students with religious backgrounds may find that the teacher or the classroom setting is inhospitable to their views. I suspect there are also some parts of the country where the opposite is true, where students with progressive political leanings may find that their views are not welcome. I think that it's important to lean against whatever orthodoxy prevails in any given community or educational setting. And where that orthodoxy comes from the left of center, I think it should be challenged. And likewise, when it comes from the right, I think that that it's important, especially at the college and university level, to expose students not only to the great moral and political philosophers of the past, but also to relate those philosophical ideas to contemporary issues that matter to students and that matter to public life generally. And doing that sometimes requires great delicacy and the ability to listen, but what's important is not to steer clear of controversy. There is a way of respectfully dealing with controversy. And just as I've been saying here, I think it's a mistake to try to keep moral controversy out of public life. I think it's an even worse mistake to try to keep moral controversy and political controversy out of intellectual life and university life. Students need to be challenged, and everyone should be made a little uncomfortable, regardless of their views politically, ideologically, morally, in a university setting. Because discomfort, unease, is a source of critical reflection and learning, especially where moral and political philosophy are at stake. So that's why I say lean against the current, lean against whatever orthodoxy prevails. I think that's a good educational principle in general.
Good, Michael. Katie?
Hi, I'm Katie Snodgrass. I'm from Bismarck, Arkansas. I'm also a student here at the Clinton School. And in one of our classes, we read Jim Wallace's book, God's Politics. And he talks about how you can judge someone's values or morals by their checkbook register. And I'm curious if you sort of agree with that, and if so, how you might judge our government's or our national budget, basically.
And I assume by that you mean what moral values are reflected in the budgetary priorities of the federal government.
Basically what you value most, you spend the most money on.
Right. Well, my own view is that I would like to see us invest more than we have in health care and in education and in addressing the gap between the rich and the poor. But in a way, it's not so much investing more as reallocating the funds that we currently do invest as a country. If you take the public and private spending together, in a way this does go back, at least as an illustration, to the question about health care and universal health care. If you compare the total amount spent on medical care in the United States with Canada, Great Britain, France, Germany, we spend more as a percentage of GDP than they do, by a long shot. Now, not all of that shows up in federal expenditures or government expenditures, because a lot of that is paid for through companies where people may work, the workplace, or premiums that individuals pay. But if you added all of that up, we're spending plenty on medical care to provide for health care for everyone, and at a level without all the lines that they have in Canada, for example, for elective surgery. But it's a matter of organizing that spending in a way that I would say that covers everyone, and that gets back to the question of solidarity and the mutual obligations of citizens.
Michael Sandel has come tonight from Harvard to talk about essays on morality and politics, public philosophy. Michael Sandel, we really appreciate you being here, but I'd just like to mention that you're wearing two hats tonight as you come to Little Rock. Your other hat that you're wearing, in addition to discussion of politics, is this afternoon you had a very enlightening discussion, I hear, at the medical school here. Dr. Chris Hackler and others. Dr. Hackler is on our faculty, and he hosted you in a group of several, I think 75 or 80 people at the medical school, talking about bioethics. And this is your other specialty. Give us a couple of paragraphs on that, if you could. Well,
it's a relatively recent interest. And I really began thinking about it when I was invited to serve on President Bush's President's Council on Bioethics. I served for 4 years until just recently, and I learned a tremendous amount. Now, here's an example. One of the things that intrigues me about it, here's an area, the debate about stem cell research, or about genetic engineering and enhancement. There's a whole new frontier of genetic knowledge and a biomedical advance that holds out great promise for curing and treating disease, but also raises very serious moral and ethical questions that are also public questions. And I found myself engaged in that council, and all of the hearings were public, in debate with colleagues who did not share, around the table there were 17 of us, we did not share the same moral and religious backgrounds. And when it comes to embryonic stem cell research, of course there's the question, what is the moral status of the early embryo? And yet we were able to have sustained and serious discussions, arguments, debates about the big moral questions involved in bioethics, stem cell research, federal funding, and so on. And in a way, it's a more arcane topic than perhaps many voters would be inclined to think about compared to other issues. But it's of growing importance, and it's an example of the way in which I think the moral positions and the faith traditions on all sides need to be taken seriously and can be.
You've been great tonight. Do you have any closing arguments for the jury here?
Jury?
We're just honored that you would come to Little Rock and be a part of our program.
It's a generous jury, and the chair of the jury is remarkable. The judge, the chair of the jury, the leader, and I would just say that, going back to the main theme with which you began, David, really a question of how to conduct political argument in a pluralist society like ours, where people disagree on important questions. That's the issue that I'm concerned with in this book, but it also strikes me that in a way is an issue that you hear in this this infant school of public service that you've founded. That's a question that you're equipping young men and women to think about, and as you form leaders of the future. So
well,
thank
we
you
truly
so much.
believe that these students, and we're going to track them in the out years,
follow you.
but we truly believe that they are here for a purpose, and that they will go out and do things that truly will change the world. And that's what this school is all about. And your discussion tonight will help us, Michael, to give us some guideposts and help us to maybe have a little tolerance and civility brought back into public discourse that we've lost. And no one could bring it to our attention and to the attention of the American public better than Michael Sandel.
Thank you
and
so
thank
much,
you for
David.
being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Public Philosophy is published by Harvard University Press. For more information, visit hup.harvard.edu.